Well, it's when men say, could we have an International Men's Day? And you said every day is International Men's Day. Well,
I've been, Hi everyone. Yay, that worked. I'm not the person you've come to hear, by the way. That's this very clever lady here. But I'm going to introduce today's event very quickly before I pass over to my colleague Ellen, who's going to introduce Professor Rippon in more detail. I work at the university. I'm the Director of People and Organisational Development. So for the students in the room, which I think is a lot, I do all the kind of people stuff and the staff stuff and all of that good stuff. So if any of you are interested in that, then give me a shout and we can talk about that. We've put on at Manchester over 30 events for International Women's Day, week, month, and I think this is going to be the most attended. So thank you for coming today. Gina's presentation is going to be fascinating. Just to put it in context, within higher education in the UK, women are represented to the tune of 55%. Then when you look more at the senior positions within higher education, both within professional services and the academy, you then start looking at about 37% representation of women. If you look at the professoriate, only 20% of the professors in the UK are women. And then if you look at black women professors, there are 35 of 14,000 in the UK. So we have some work to do in terms of gender and ethnicity equity, and that's one of the things that I'm really passionate about in my role, and one of the reasons why we put on this event and other events this week. And if you're interested in being involved next year, then please do get involved and get engaged, because this is important. We want to create an environment and a culture at Manchester where there's equity of opportunity for everybody, irrespective of where you come from, your background, your gender, your ability or disability. So let's work together and make that happen. So without further ado, because you did not come to listen to me, I'm going to pass you over to Ellen. Thank you.
Well, it's fantastic to see so many of you here today. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Gina Rippon, who's an emeritus professor in cognitive neuroimaging at the Aston Brain Centre, Aston University. And she's previously been the president of the British Association of Cognitive Neuroscience and is a fellow of the British Science Association. And I've known her through work through the British Science Festival. So a couple of years ago, pre-pandemic, we organised an event about girls and women in autism, which was really very interesting. Her research has focused on neurodevelopmental disorders such as dyslexia and autism, and she's also very interested in gender stereotyping. She's also very passionate about the idea of neuroscience being misrepresented in the media, and we'll be talking about some of the contentious issues around female and male brains very soon. And just to highly recommend her Gendered Brain book if you haven't read it already. Particularly, I know some of you in the audience have a background in neuroscience or psychology, so there's a lot of really great stuff to inspire your studies and research in there. So without further ado, I will hand over to Gina, who will tell you more.
Thank you very much, Adele. Thank you very much, Ellen, for a really great introduction. Really good to see so many of you here today. This is actually the fourth event I've done this week, and so it is nice to hear that people are starting to listen, starting to have the discussion. And it's great that Manchester has organised so many events, of which this is one, and I'm very honoured to be asked. So I was told fairly late on that I have 30 minutes as opposed to 45, so I will move on fairly quickly to talk to you about how I'm going to address this issue under the heading of Break the Bias. So what I'm going to look at is, as Ellen mentioned, I'm very interested in the ideas of stereotypes and how they actually affect individuals and the impact they can have on people's lives. But as a neuroscientist, I'm also interested in understanding whether or not they might change our brains. There are stereotypes about the brains, as I'll be talking about, but whether or not those stereotypes will change our brains. And that's really what I'm going to be talking about, because there is an underpinning message with the idea that there is a female brain and a male brain, which is that however much in terms of social justice, or however you like to phrase the issue, we're worried about gender gaps, maybe they're just the expression of something innate, something natural, something we can do nothing about. And so there is this question, do you have a female brain or a male brain, or are we asking the wrong question? Okay, so just very briefly, just to say, I work at the Aston Brain Centre, as Ellen mentioned, and I use the sort of various different kinds of techniques for literally rummaging around in people's brains, metaphorically anyway, not literally, to kind of get a feel for how they respond in the face of different kind of tasks. So as a psychologist, I help generate the tasks, and as a neuroscientist, I do a lot with the data, etc. So there's a whole range of issues here. Just to say, you know, that's effectively what I do and where my interest in the brain comes from and where I get the data from to address some of these questions. Just very briefly, I would say, because this is quite a contentious area, as we'll see shortly, one of the things that people lose sight of when anybody challenges the idea of findings from sex differences research, and I have been called a sex difference denier and a feminazi among some of the more polite things that I've been accused of being, very often people forget why are we asking these questions? Are we asking because we know there are sex differences in brain disease? For example, more females suffer from Alzheimer's than males, more males suffer from Parkinson's disease than females. What is the basis of this? Is knowing somebody's sex really, really important in getting to the bottom of this, or are we looking at just one of the influences that we need to understand? There's also the idea that there are quite marked sex differences in mental health epidemiology. So many more women are diagnosed as suffering from depression or eating disorders, many more suicides among young men, etc. So that's a very important issue to address. But probably what I'm going to talk about mainly, almost exclusively today in terms of International Women's Day and the idea that we should break the bias, is looking at gender gaps in society. And very often people will look at these gender gaps, and in a way I'll talk a bit about the history of this kind of research, taking the status quo and working backwards and say, maybe there are these gaps because we've got different brains, and you know, from that comes a certain amount of arguments. Okay, so I would, in terms of people being assured they're in a safe space, when I got very interested in understanding differences in the brain, not a lot of neuroscience is about assuming the brain is much the same in everybody and how does the brain process language or be creative, etc. But because I'm very interested in developmental disorders such as autism, how do brains get to be different? And so I started looking at what was then, you know, the best known difference that everybody agreed on, that males and females had different brains. And I started looking at the psychological evidence of that and the neuroscience evidence and started to challenge it. And probably unsurprisingly, it wasn't always that popular. So I will now just give you a bit of feedback about what I have been accused of doing, just in case anybody wants to slip out the back door. So the Telegraph, one of our earnest newspapers, Christina Rodoni, this theory smacks of feminism with an equality fetish. So I kind of love the idea that if you're interested in equality, it's some kind of perverse practice. The Daily Mail, straight to the point. I clearly have an agenda. Grumpy old harridan, So the New Scientist, you might be surprised by this. This was a reader of an article I wrote in the New Scientist who felt I was best described as, and I've got rid of the worst bits, a post-menopausal affirmative action loser, which did take me back a bit. And I thought, actually, that's New Scientist speak for grumpy old harridan. So, clearly some kind of consensus there. But my favourite is the Daily Mail, again, who accused me of being full of carp. Now, I'm assuming that's a spelling mistake. So anyway, you kind of get the impression that although as I'm a neuroscientist, I do talk about research, there is a political agenda, and very often it's the political agenda that people focus on, and quite appropriately too, when we're talking about International Women's Day or any kind of gender gaps throughout the year. So effectively, what I'm going to be talking about is the kind of thinking that has actually informed a lot of research right from the beginning, right from the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century. There was this idea that you looked at the society as it was structured then, and clearly women were inferior, and that was clearly stated, to men. And therefore, the emerging science of studying the brain said, well, we must demonstrate how women's brains are inferior. So there was a lot of measuring of the empty skulls, filling them with birdseed and seeing who had the biggest brains. And strangely enough, in this area, always as kind of size matters issues came through. On average, and that's really important to remember, men's brains were about 5 ounces, found to be about 5 ounces heavier than females. So at last the truth, and that's a phrase we'll come back to. The idea was that if you had a bigger brain, you were cleverer. And then somebody pointed out that sperm whales and elephants actually have brains much bigger than human male brains, and generally they're not known for being that much cleverer. So they had to rejig the metrics, and effectively, I may get back to that later, if the metrics didn't come up with the answer that at the top of any scale was white, because it intersected with race science as well, upper class as well, males, then there was something wrong with the metric, and you had to get rid of the metric because you needed white males at the top, women and children a bit white, women and children a bit further down, then lower classes, capital L, capital C, and then other races. So there was a clear agenda being played out at the time to prove that the brain was at the behind all of these differences, with the message that these were fixed, so that you had two types of body, whatever it was that determined the anatomical differences between males and females, and this is before we knew about hormones and genes, etc., also meant that you had a different type of brain. So if you had a female anatomy, you had a lady brain. If you had a male anatomy, you had a manly brain. And then consequent on that, and this is where the experimental psychologists weighed in as well, it meant if you had that kind of brain, there was a whole range of skills that went with it. So if you had a lady brain, you were very good at empathy, and there was a whole list of things, characteristics that you were, anybody who just knew somebody was female would be able to say, oh, this person will be emotional, will cry a lot, will be gentle, etc., but rubbish at reading maps, for example. Whereas the manly brain meant that you were incredibly good at scientific processing, you're very good at mental rotation, come back to that again possibly. You were logical, rational, but you weren't very good at listening, so you didn't understand much about emotion, and you were analytical and rational. And with this kind of set of portfolios, it meant that here, and this is where we're starting to look at gender gaps, it meant that you were very good at being a carer, at being a primary school teacher, being a mother, etc. Whereas if you had these set of skills, you were going to be a genius scientist, you were going to be a great explorer, you were going to be a leader of the human world, etc. And that was very well fixed. This was right from the, as I say, the end of the 18th century. There was this chain of argument: two types of body, two types of brain. And I use the word two advisedly, we will come back to that. Two types of skill sets, two types of social roles. Nice, straightforward argument, inevitable, something that you couldn't change. And this really was something which became very well embedded within beliefs about the brain and about how the brain determined behavior. So male and female brains arrived in the world differently. The male brain with some of the key skills, which was going to make them a winner later on when they developed. And as they grew, they acquired more of these essential skills because they were allowed to be educated, for example. But anyway, they were, naturally embedded in their brain. And eventually you arrived at a full-size brain, perhaps the end of the teens, beginning of the 20s. And that was the kind of brain that was going to make you a genius scientist. Whereas if you were a female, which obviously I've cheekily coloured this brain slightly pink, you didn't arrive with the necessary kind of skills. You weren't exposed to the exigencies of higher education. In the 19th century, people got very anxious about women wanting to enter education because it was felt that their brains were rather fragile. And if they're exposed to higher education, that would affect their reproductive tendencies. And there was a condition called anorexia scholastica, which was the kind of things that women suffered from if they read too much. And eventually you arrived at a female brain, which was characterized as being very different from the male brain, emotionally quite labile. I've dressed it up in 21st century stereotypes, liked pink, like being a princess. And we might come back to that as well. And so this was very, very well fixed. There was a male brain, there was a female brain. It was fixed, it wasn't changed, etc. And this was supported by books such as this by Simon Baron-Cohen, written just at the beginning of this century, in fact, The Essential Difference. And this is an area where language is actually quite important. I probably won't have much time to talk about this in the talk, but we might get back to this question and answer. Essential here means some kind of biological essence, something that biology has given you. But I bet if I'd stopped you as you came in and said to you, what does essential mean? You'd probably say, well, something really important, something that we must have. So language is giving an impression as well. Opening lines of his book, The Female Brain, so there is such a thing, is hardwired. And that's another phrase which is used quite a lot, for empathy. So we clearly know what female brains are like and what they're for. The male brain is hardwired for understanding systems. And so a very clear statement from a neuroscientist about the differences between male and female brains. At the other end, possibly the other end of the spectrum, there's these kind of books, what I call neurotrash, which people will be familiar with, where sort of neuroscience ideas have been hijacked, misrepresented, misunderstood, very often by self-help gurus or relationship counselors, etc. And there's a huge array of these kind of books, which you can still find in the bookshop. So there was a big kind of tide of these just about the time that neuroimaging became much more accessible, and we were able to look at intact living brains in intact living humans. But these are the kind of books that characterize a lot of beliefs that are still found to inform educational policy and parenting advice and even marketing, etc. So moving along, the other thing that we also find is that the media is always hungry for these kind of stories. There's some kind of obscure neuroscience journal publishes a paper tentatively suggesting that there's some kind of sex differences in a brain, which they've reported in this particular group. And within weeks, there's a heading, at last, the truth, men and women are different. The scientists have caught up. So within, neuroscience is functioning partly through its own contribution within a world that has a very strong belief about differences between male and female brains. So as I mentioned, all of these theories actually arrived before we had neuroimaging. We only had, feeling bumps on skulls, or we could look at the consequences of brain injury or brain disease and say what functions had changed that might tell us about which bit of the brain was involved, etc. But we'd never really been able to look at the brain properly. And if you look at remember some of the images I showed of the techniques at the beginning that we use, you could see that we now can put intact living human beings, sometimes somewhat reluctantly, in a scanner, give them a whole range of tasks, and actually have a really good look at how the brain processes information, how it responds to instructions, etc. So you could say that this would be a great time to for neuroscience to step back and say, let's forget this hunt the difference agenda. Let's really have a look at brains, see what they're like, see how we can characterize them. But unfortunately, the hunt the difference agenda continued. Very early papers, I think one of the third papers that was published was looking at the differences between how males and females processed language, looking at the brain data associated with that. So the hunt the difference agenda continued. And you could say, so the first part of our chain of argument, do you have a female brain or a male brain? Let's see what 21st century neuroscience has got to say about that. And what we find is that if you have a quick look at, if you did a PubMed search or a Google Scholar search, you're saying there are thousands of papers. I was looking just recently, in the last 2 years, there's been 8,000 publications in neuroscience journals talking about sex differences. So you think, well, clearly there are, because look at all of these papers. But what we found is that if you start to look behind the actual number of papers, you'll find that, yes, there are differences being reported, but they're never the same differences. You'll get one group saying, men have got a bigger amygdala, women have got a thicker corpus callosum. Another group will come out with a different set of findings. Oh, no, the amygdala is the same, et cetera, et cetera. So we're starting to think, well, there does seem to be a lot of findings, but they're not consistent. And so we were getting studies which were things like sex differences in the adult human brain, evidence from 5,000 biobank participants. You think we've got huge data sets because labs are now putting their data sets together. So this must be right. And, as I mentioned, you get popular press, proof at last, women and men are born to be different. So the story continues. The reason I put this iceberg up here is to say that above the kind of, if you like, the kind of publication body here, you've got lots that we actually see which talk about sex differences, which science journalists pick up and say, oh, look, there's, 500 papers have described sex differences, so there must be sex differences. But then you say, well, actually, if you have a hunt the difference agenda, and as scientists, I'm sure you all know this, you set up a hypothesis. I expect there to be a difference between males and females in doing X task or Y, following Y instructions, etc. If you don't find that, then you might think, oh, I've done something wrong. I won't publish that. You might submit it for publication and somebody said you must have done something wrong because you didn't find a difference. And even within the papers that are published, because brain imaging allows us to do literally hundreds of thousands of comparisons. So you get these papers which have got these dense data tables, which have now actually made into supplementary material, where you can see somebody did 134,000 comparisons. And the whole paper is about the 74 which were statistically significant. So we are getting a kind of misleading story, because in fact, if you think either people are different or they are similar or the same, then actually findings where you don't find differences would say, well, that's quite a lot of evidence for the similarity. But that's not what gets talked about. But luckily, just last year, yes, that's right, a paper came out where Lise Elliott and colleagues in Chicago had been through the last 30 years of publications from neuroscience journals and saying, let's have a meta-analysis, let's have a look at all of the studies, let's find where these differences are, let's find the size of these differences, how consistent they are, summarize them all and see if we can find the answer, what is the thread. And lovely title, Dump the Dimorphism. Having looked at all of these data sets, it's quite clear that there are very, very few female-male brain differences apart from size. That is the one thing that the 18th century scientists did get right. On average, male brains are about 8 to 10% bigger than female brains, but that's because males are on average about 8 to 10% bigger than females. So it's a scaling issue. And if you correct for the size differences in terms of individuals in a variety of different ways I won't go into, you'll find all the other differences that you've been carefully studying and measuring and reporting disappear. So we must move beyond the idea that there is such a thing as a female and a male brain. Moving on quickly then, we should say, but in our chain of argument, How about this female way of doing things, about women being empathic? And we've been hearing a lot about that in the last 2 years, about empathic leadership, etc., and women bringing something special to the table. Now, you could say I shouldn't knock that because, you know, probably we need people to be saying that. But I'm afraid the evidence doesn't support that. If you actually go through all of the studies that the experimental psychologists have carried out over the last 100 years or so and look at these well-known differences between males and females, you will find almost exactly the same as Lise Elliott's team found in brain studies. You will find that all of these differences do not stand up to close scrutiny. There's a couple of really interesting papers which do the same. A paper by Janet Hyde did a meta-analysis of all the studies. And then there were lots and lots of meta-analyses. And then to really kill a blow, Ethan Zell and colleagues did a meta-synthesis. And that's a meta-analysis of meta-analyses, if any of you are mathematicians. But what they really found was that any differences which were assumed, and that's even between tasks measuring masculinity and femininity, were vanishingly small. And there's a great paper, Black and White or Shades of Grey, Are Gender Differences Categorical or Dimensional? And that is very interesting in terms of current discussions about gender, for example. And interesting, we have the term gender there, and I will come back to that at the end, because somehow sex or biological differences have morphed into gender. And this is still how neuroscience is reporting these kind of things, saying perhaps we shouldn't be thinking about these two boxes, perhaps as a single dimension or a set of dimensions which better capture differences between people. But unfortunately, most of this sort of stays within the neuroscience community, and perhaps that's why I wrote The Gendered Brain and why I'm talking to you today, because it is a message that needs to be got out there, because it is a message that boys and girls are different, which informs education policy, it informs parenting advice, it informs marketing, and then you get this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy where these wonderfully little plastic brains of children are exposed to girls play with these kind of toys, boys play with those kind of toys, girls dress like that, boys dress like this, and surprise, surprise, they grow up to play with those kind of toys or to enter those kind of professions where those toys have appropriately trained them, or not to enter those kind of professions if they haven't had those kind of experiences. So this is really important. This is not just either an anatomical argument about differences or an academic argument about data sets, etc. So we now say, well, let's have a look at this model where there's no such thing as male or female brain. We're really not that sure that there are differences in behaviour. But what about gender gaps? And in a way, you could say quite a lot about what the International Women's Day is about gender gaps. So I think one picture is worth 1,000 words. People will say, it doesn't matter. There's lots and lots of worthy initiatives going on. We're moving along. It won't be long before we're living in a nice gender equal world. Okay, so just as I say, perhaps without words, I will just say that this is a picture taken about 2 or 3 weeks ago at an international conference of the CEOs of the top cybersecurity firms in the world. Now, I don't know about you, and I did actually peer quite closely at this image, just in case there was a female face came in. There is not a lot of diversity in that particular, and maybe they're different. So, but anyway, let's move on quickly. I just thought I would show you that because I came across that quite recently. Okay, so what about gender gaps? Well, this is something I find really worrying in terms of how we're going, and this claim that, despite the evidence we've just been looking at, that the world is moving in the right direction, and you know, not to worry, we will eventually reach gender equality. Now, every year, the World Economic Forum produces a global gender gap report, and they look at over nearly 160 different countries now, a range of different measures of gender inequality or equality or closeness to equality. And they generate a metric which measures how close any one country is to being really gender equal, males and females having nearly equal political representation or access to healthcare or education, etc. And they've been doing that for about 20 years. So they actually track how those metrics change year by year. And in theory, if we're moving in the right direction, all of those should be showing that the gender gap is gradually diminishing. In 2020, when they looked at all of their 160 countries and did an analysis of all the differences, how long would it take before the world is genuinely equal? They came up with a rather worrying metric of 99.5 years. It's going to take nearly 100 years in 2020, they said, for the world to reach true gender equality. This year, well, last year now, in 2021, as a consequence perhaps of the pandemic, and that may be questions we can ask about, it's gone up a whole generation. So we're now looking at 135.6 years until the world reaches genuine gender equality. And I think that's really quite scaring in terms of what we're trying to do and the arguments that we're having. I mean, clearly, that's never going to happen, but I just think it's an interesting metric to show how this is still an issue that we should be concerned about. Okay, and just because this is a science community, quite a lot of you are scientists, I would think, is to say this is particularly evident within the science community. The underrepresentation of women is another passion of mine in science, is another passion of mine. Really argue that there is something wrong with science, that there is such a big gap. And looking at the kind of top countries and a report from UNESCO. But this, I don't know if you can actually see it closely, but just to give you the flavor of it, it's looking at what they call emerging jobs, the kind of jobs which are going to determine how our lives are organized and run in the next 100 years. Looking at the change in gender composition within those jobs. These are the people who are going to determine the algorithms which will drive all sorts of metrics, who will be devising, building the robots, etc. And what's really worrying is that, I don't know if you can see those numbers, but they are tiny. The percentage, the gender composition, females in those jobs is tiny. And one in particular, the computer science one and AI, is actually going backwards. So again, this is something we need to be really worried about. That, and I'm talking obviously in terms of International Women's Day, in terms of gender, but as Adele mentioned, there are also issues of ethnic minorities, of people with disabilities, people with different sexual orientation. So all of these principles, these are all underrepresented people that we still need to try and do something about. I need to move on. I will move on just very quickly and say, so it's all very well me standing up and spouting statistics. Can neuroscientists tell us anything about it? Can neuroscience actually explain what's going on? And really what I'm saying is yes, 21st century neuroscience has a new way of thinking about brains, which is going to be much more helpful, hopefully, in understanding why we are still looking at gender gaps. And I will go through this quite quickly, and I can talk about it afterwards. It's what I call the 3 Ps. The fact that our brains are not just passive recipients of information, it's now clear that they are what we call predictive texters, as a P as a way of remembering something. They are rule-seeking. They're constantly looking at the outside environment. What is the best, if you see this particular sound, what does it mean? If you hear this, if you see this sight, what does it mean? If you hear this sound, what does it mean? But even higher level cognition and even social skills as well. And I'll come back to that. So our brains are rule-hungry scavengers, if you like. Similarly, our brains are plastic. If you remember that image I showed right at the beginning with the kind of fixed brains at the end that didn't change, so that people arguing against diversity are saying, well, this is an inevitable difference, nothing we can do about it. That is absolutely not true. We now know that brains will change according to the experiences they have, and the amount of experience they have will change in one direction. Nice studies done with taxi drivers, looking at taxi drivers in London learning the knowledge, and retired taxi drivers. And the changes in their brain quite clearly measure their ability to do this amazing visuospatial skill of acquiring the knowledge. Interestingly, those differences in their brain disappear when they retire. So our brains wax and wane throughout life according to the experiences we have. And similarly, our brains are permeable. If you give 2 groups of people exactly the same task and you say, I'd like you to solve this problem, people like you are very good at this task, or people like you are not very good at this task, you will find, surprise, surprise, that the people with the negative message make more mistakes. And also the parts of their brain which are activated are much more to do with processing those errors, not with solving the problem. Whereas those with the positive message, they actually are much better at solving the problem, and the appropriate areas of their brain are activated. Becoming anxious about the time now. So The other thing that we need to notice is that we're now looking at our brain as something not just which gives us language and sets the human race apart from non-human animals. It's also wired to make us social. We have systems within the brain that are constantly picking up social information, the social scripts we should be following, and coding them according to whether this was a good experience or a bad experience. And we have a kind of traffic light system, which is where I spend a lot of my time rummaging in brains, which will actually guide your behavior appropriately. Don't approach that social situation, you don't belong to that group, it'll be negative. Or this worked out really well when you did this before, so I should do more of that. So we have this kind of system which actually is enabling us to be part of a big community. So what is the importance of that? And I will just very briefly, again, given the time, go through this and say what it's actually saying is that external experiences, being in a social being, in a social world, will change our brains. And these are some of the studies I've been involved in, quite unpleasant, giving people negative social experiences while they're lying in the scanner. When did you make that mistake? That was really your fault, wasn't it? And whereabouts do you think you are in the pecking order in your department or something, etc. So we do find, and what gets activated is this traffic light system, which is inhibitory. And luckily not necessarily always associated with the people that I have been scanning. It's associated with people who have very poor self-image, people who are very anxious about being rejected by any kind of group they might wish to belong to, people with very high levels of self-criticism, always blaming themselves for making a mistake, and people who effectively withdraw, they silence themselves. So this is a very powerful driver within the brain, the drive to belong, and it will change our behavior accordingly. And it is shown to be so powerful because it's associated with the kind of activation you get in real pain. So this kind of social rejection is very unpleasant, and it will drive your behavior appropriately. So effectively what I'm saying is that we should be looking at the world as a brain influencer. What goes on outside the brain is as important as what goes on inside. So we've moved from the inside out model to let's have a look at the outside. And remembering that, the theme of International Women's Day is Break the Bias. And we're aiming for a world free of bias and stereotypes, a world that is diverse, equitable, and inclusive. Now, I could leave this here, and probably given the time, I will do very shortly, but just to give you a flavor of some of the things that we could say, I really believe that stereotypes are quite harmful, and I've been involved in various commissions, for example, the Fawcett Society, which has looked at the effect of stereotypes on children's behavior, children's self-belief, and children's ultimate choices of where they think they're going to go in the future. So this is a gendered world, which is going to, if you like, produce a gendered brain. And the kind of things I look at is stereotypes about scientists, for example, or the kind of cheery statements made by male scientists about whether or not women belong in science. And actually, the fact that science itself is starting to acknowledge that there is bias within science. So maybe if we're looking at gender gaps, we should say, is this something to do with the individual, or is it something to do with the organization, which they have, for whatever reason, chosen not to enter or chosen not to remain in? And these are questions not focusing just on the individual, but saying, let's have a look at the culture. Okay, so the way in which we can resolve this is what I call the whack-a-mole problem, where there is constantly people saying, oh, neuroscientists have shown that. And people like me will stand up and say, no, I'm sorry, that's wrong. And you think that they'll listen to me and they won't quote that anymore. Next couple of weeks, out it comes in the newspaper. Everybody knows that girls don't choose to do science because biologically they prefer people as opposed to things, etc. So I would say to people, there's a game called whack-a-mole where you're constantly hitting something on the head and you think, right, that's it, and then it pops up somewhere else. So I'd encourage any of you who are involved in this kind of area to be whack-a-mole activists, to say, no, that is actually wrong. We have proved that to be wrong. And the question that I was asking right at the beginning, do you have a female brain or a male brain? We are asking the wrong question. That is not going to give us any useful answers. So that's another mole you can whack on the head. And just to remind you of, we do have some way to go. But luckily, with lots of interest in International Women's Day, we might eventually be able to break the bias. And I will finish then. Sorry.
So we've got a few interesting questions
to
look at.
Okay.
So the first one is, what do you think has contributed to the increase in the gender gap that you mentioned?
Well, I think a lot of it is to do with, I mean, I didn't go into the details of the metric itself, but it's to do with political representation, but it's also to do with gender pay gaps, it's to do with financial activity, etc. And the data are clearly showing that it appears to be the female workforce which has been impacted most by the effect of the pandemic. So I'm sure part of that gap has arisen from the impact, either financially or perhaps with respect to the issues of working from home, homeschooling, all of those kind of practical issues, and what the consequences might be for individuals' outputs and activities. I'm sure there's lots more reasons, but...
So there's another question about skills that can be interchanged between the genders. So the top one there, how can men be born with skills expected from women and vice versa?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's about the plastic brain, if you like. I mean, there's some really nice studies done on this idea that, you know, men have a science brain. They're really good at spatial rotation and logic and rationality, etc. A big survey done in the States about 3 years ago, which found that on average, and I keep saying on average, it's to say that we're talking about population levels here, but if you take the data from males and females on any task or brain measure, hugely overlapping, tiny average differences between them, big variabilities within the populations, which I think actually is much more interesting than these differences between these, not artificially constrained categories, I mean, because sex and male and female is a biological characteristic. But anyway, on average, males did tend to do better on a big range of visuospatial skills. But then they went back and asked their participants, what kind of visuospatial experience have you had? What toys did you play with as a child? What hobbies do you have? What sports do you play? Do you play video games? Because a lot of video games are very visuospatial. And once they'd got a visuospatial training opportunity score or visuospatial experience score from their participants and factored that into the comparison, the sex differences disappeared. So what you were actually looking at was a kind of cultural consequence of the fact that there's large groups of people who are not given the kind of training opportunities that toys, sports, etc. So if you extend from that, you could say that's how we can exchange skills. It's found that children, and there's a neuroscience study showing that children playing with dolls' houses and dolls show activation in the kind of social areas of the brain. So that being able to play with those kind of toys also encourages a kind of social interactional script being developed. So I think in answer to that, that's why we need to be aware that the brain is plastic and that people can be brought up, in particular, that's the key area, I think, early years. Sorry, I'm going on too long with my answers.
There's so many good questions coming through. I'm getting a bit overwhelmed.
Oh,
so
right,
apologies to those of you that are sending in fantastic questions. One that I thought was very interesting is, can we rewire our brains to address stereotyping and be more inclusive?
Yes, I mean, I think I get a bit anxious about terms like rewiring, because in the way that I attacked neurotrash, because it was, you know, brain imaging was hijacked and we had these wonderful images without any axes or explanations, etc., in these self-help books. Rewiring has become a kind of term that lots of kind of counsellors and things are using. Effectively, it's a metaphor. Yes, you can make your brain process information in a different way. And we know that by looking at, for example, the People Like You study. So yes, we can rewire our brain, but be careful of overusing that metaphor, because it seems to be one that's become very popular among, I shouldn't necessarily criticise counsellors, but you know, sometimes they run away with the neuroscience.
There's been a few questions asking about the brains of transgender people.
Yeah,
Have you got-
okay. Yes, I mean, I think, how long have you got? One of the things I was trying to demonstrate is that chain of argument right at the beginning, in a way, was how sex, the biological differences, they didn't know how they arrived at them, but there was clearly anatomical differences, got to be gender, which is what you did in society. And I could spend ages defining sex and gender, but I think it's important that we know there is this difference. But the argument I'm trying to make is that we should be breaking that claim that there is an unbreakable link between sex, the biological sex, and what you do in society and the skills you have and the personality you show. And I think that should be broken. There is an argument about biology and how we should label it, etc., which is certainly important to have. But whether or not we should have this binary view of gender, because it was always assumed there was a binary view of sex, I think that's absolutely wrong. And I would hope that would help trans people, because it would be extracting this feeling that, I am a girl and here's a list of what girls are like and none of the above. So there must be something wrong with me. I was born in the wrong box is a claim. And quite a lot of effort is made to change boxes. And what I'm trying to say is that we should actually be challenging the idea that there are boxes. I think that would be a much better way forward.
There's a question of what advice would you give to a young woman from ethnic minority background?
I think, actually I would say very good luck, because you've got a kind of cross-cultural issues, because you've got the fact that you're female, but you've also got the fact that you're an ethnic minority. Sometimes you can, and there's lots of talks about resilience, and there are ways of increasing resilience, and sometimes it's just being aware this is what you're going to encounter, and that can be helpful. But the focus there is on the individual. And, I wouldn't necessarily say to some poor young girl of an ethnic minority, what you need to do is stand up to the organisation and call it out, etc. But mentoring is really important. If you can find people who will help, if you can find out where the kind of chinks in the organisational armour are, and work, because there are a lot of really good support mechanisms. But you do have to call it out, because it is part of the culture. And the people who are in charge are comfortable with being in charge. There's a great phrase, if you've lived a life of privilege, then equality can feel like oppression. So they're the ones in charge. So, it's comfortable for them. They don't want somebody coming along and saying, we need more diversity. But you can even sell that, actually, because you can say to businesses, if they're only interested in the bottom line, the evidence is that more diverse groups are more creative, produce better results, more profit-making, etc. So it's a long, hard road, but it's a road that lots of people are supporting, and hopefully these kind of discussions will allow you to fight your corner.
Do you mind if I just say a few words
yes,
on that? A brilliant question, whoever asked that. And from a Manchester perspective, I'm absolutely passionate about this, and I would say a few things, and I know it's really difficult when you're maybe young in your career or a student, but I think having a voice at a really early age is critically important. And I didn't get my voice till later on in life, and I really wish I'd had it earlier. The other thing I want to say, it's not about fixing the woman, it's about fixing the system. So I think there's lots of deficit models, and what can you do differently to be accepted in this organisation? That's all BS, right? If we have really inclusive organisations where everyone has an opportunity, that's what we should be working on. We should be calling out the structural, the systemic, the process, the attitudinal issues that are getting in the way for women and other people with protected characteristics to thrive. And if anyone wants to have another conversation about that with me, then I'd really appreciate that.
Thanks. It's always good to have a practitioner. I mean, I stand here as a theoretician saying this is what you should do. But.
And just to say, you've probably been reading some of them, so they come up. There are so many brilliant questions, and apologies that we won't get through all of them. someone has just mentioned about the fact that nearly everyone in this room is female in the audience, and what can we do about spreading that further? And I think that's...
I think, I was going to pick up on something Adele said. It said, of course, it's also to do with involving everybody, and nothing's going to change, because you're still going to have othering people who, you know, even if you get more of these other people, which sometimes is what the gender pay gaps are about. There's a question there about gender. You need to demonstrate that everybody has a contribution and should be equally valued, that you don't just want, and this is why I do talk to practitioners, diversity and inclusion. You need inclusion as well as diversity. You don't just want to say, oh, we've got 16 more women than we had last year, hurrah for us kind of thing. You need to make sure that those women have a voice at the table, and you need that by involving the other participants, who are quite often male.
Again, if the practitioner can just be... We did a fabulous session earlier this week on men as allies. So two of our most senior men on the senior leadership team at Manchester did a session about why gender equity is important to them. And that's critically important, because they are the people who hold the power and have the influence. So they have to be brought in. And then just to echo Gina's point, you know, this looks to me like quite a diverse, albeit not from a gender perspective, audience. But even when we get to diversity, genuine diversity in the room, that's not inclusion. And, you know, our society is struggling with diversity, let alone inclusion. And there's that classic expression, you know, diversity is being asked to the party and inclusion is being asked to dance. And that's been rubbish recently, because actually I might not want to dance. So it's about creating that environment where we can all bring our kind of talents and strengths.
Okay.
So we should probably, unfortunately, wrap up there with the questions, but do stay around afterwards for the networking session if you've got further questions. Is that whereabouts? Is that downstairs?
Downstairs.
So
are these, if people want me to answer those, can you send them to me or something? Or?
I think we can probably just take this with, actually.
Okay.
So,
That's a good idea.
Yeah.
Right.
Thank
you very much. Great questions. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. So just to mention that, just to thank Gina hugely for her talk, but just to mention that there's a charity collection for the River charity in Manchester that supports people fleeing from domestic violence. So they'll be taking donations of clothes and accessories, I think today and tomorrow, is that right? Today and next week. And do please join us on the ground floor for refreshments after the session. And thank you all so much for your fantastic questions. Yes. And people at home as well, thank you for joining us.
Sorry.